Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a world where a toothache could become the most terrifying event of your entire life. A world without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without modern dentists, and without any reliable way to stop pain once it began. Tonight, we follow the life of one ordinary medieval man whose greatest enemy was not war, famine, plague, or bandits. It was a single rotten tooth. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in comfortably. Maybe dim the lights, perhaps grab a blanket, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. As always, if you enjoy these journeys into the stranger corners of history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now let us begin. The year was 1287. The village of Bricewell sat beside a narrow river in northern England. It was not an important place. No king had ever visited. No great battle had ever occurred nearby. Travelers usually passed without remembering its name. A collection of timber houses surrounded a small church. Fields stretched across rolling hills. A few sheep wandered between stone walls. Life moved slowly. Most people expected to be born, work, marry, grow old, and die within a few miles of where they first opened their eyes. Among the villagers lived a man named Thomas Weaver. Thomas was 34 years old. He farmed barley alongside his father. He owned a small cottage with a thatched roof. His wife Agnes cared for their 2 children. By medieval standards, Thomas was fortunate. He was not rich. Nobody in Bricewell was rich. Yet his family usually had enough bread to survive the winter. Their cow remained healthy. Their harvests were acceptable. Their roof leaked less than many others. For years, his life followed a familiar rhythm. He woke before sunrise, worked until darkness, returned home exhausted, ate simple meals, slept, repeated the process, day after day, season after season. Nothing dramatic happened, which was exactly how most villagers preferred life. Excitement usually arrived carrying trouble. One autumn morning, Thomas noticed a faint ache near the back of his mouth. At first, he ignored it. The sensation felt insignificant. Farmers experienced discomfort constantly. Their backs hurt, their knees hurt, their hands hurt. A little pain inside the mouth seemed unworthy of attention. So he continued working. The following week, the ache returned. This time it lingered longer. While chewing coarse bread, he felt a sharp sting. He paused, pressed his tongue against a molar. The tooth felt slightly sensitive. Again, he dismissed it. After all, medieval people rarely viewed dental problems as emergencies. They possessed few effective solutions. Ignoring discomfort often seemed easier than confronting it. Unfortunately, teeth in medieval Europe faced difficult conditions. People consumed bread made from grain ground between stone millstones. Tiny fragments of grit frequently mixed with flour. Over years, these particles slowly wore down enamel. A lifetime of chewing could grind teeth significantly. Diet also contributed to problems. Although medieval peasants consumed less sugar than modern people, tooth decay still occurred. Honey sweetened foods. Fruit provided natural sugars. Poor oral hygiene allowed bacteria to flourish. Most people never brushed in a modern sense. Some cleaned their teeth using cloths, sticks, herbs, or rinses. Others did very little. Knowledge varied widely. Scientific understanding remained limited. Thomas belonged to the latter group. He occasionally rinsed his mouth, sometimes chewed mint leaves. That was the extent of his dental care. Winter approached. Cold winds swept across the fields. The harvest concluded. Livestock returned to shelters. One evening, Thomas bit into a hard crust. A sudden bolt of pain shot through his jaw. The sensation was immediate and brutal. He dropped the bread. Agnes looked up. "What happened?" "My tooth." She frowned. "Still troubling you?" Thomas nodded. The ache faded after several moments. Yet something had changed. This was no longer a minor irritation. The damaged tooth had begun announcing its presence. Days passed. Pain arrived more frequently. Cold air triggered discomfort. Eating became unpleasant. Sleep occasionally suffered. Thomas grew irritable. Not dramatically, only slightly. The kind of quiet frustration that accumulates when discomfort never fully disappears. Neighbors offered advice. Medieval communities always possessed advice. Whether useful or not was another matter. An elderly woman suggested placing crushed sage against the tooth. Another recommended garlic. Someone else advocated warm wine mixed with herbs. A shepherd insisted rubbing the gums with vinegar solved everything. Thomas tried several remedies. None achieved much. For a short time, certain treatments seemed helpful. Then the pain returned, often worse than before. The village priest proposed prayer. Thomas prayed. The tooth continued hurting. By Christmas, the problem had become impossible to ignore. A cavity had likely formed deep within the molar. Though nobody in Bricewell understood bacteria, they certainly understood suffering. The pain now arrived in waves. Some mornings felt manageable. Others felt unbearable. Occasionally, he pressed a hand against his jaw while working. His father noticed. "You should seek help." "From whom?" The older man hesitated. This represented the central difficulty. Professional dentistry barely existed for ordinary villagers. Large towns sometimes contained practitioners willing to remove teeth. Barbers occasionally performed extractions. Certain surgeons attempted dental procedures. Traveling healers offered services of varying quality. Yet expertise differed enormously. There were no standardized qualifications, no licenses hanging on walls, no guarantees. A man might claim experience. Whether that claim was true remained uncertain. The nearest market town lay nearly 15 miles away. Thomas disliked the idea. Travel consumed time, treatment cost money, and everyone knew what dental treatment usually meant. Extraction, removing the tooth. Nothing more. No filling. No root canal. No crown. Simply removal. If successful, the pain disappeared. If unsuccessful, other problems might emerge. Stories circulated endlessly. A man whose jaw fractured. A woman who nearly bled to death. Someone whose wound became infected. Whether these tales were accurate hardly mattered. People believed them. Fear grew accordingly. Thomas delayed making a decision. January arrived. Snow covered the countryside. The tooth continued deteriorating. Then one night, everything changed. He awoke shortly after midnight. At first, he felt confused. The room remained dark. The fire had nearly died. Outside, wind rattled the walls. Then the pain struck. A violent throbbing exploded through the side of his face. Thomas sat upright instantly. His jaw felt as though someone had driven a hot iron into it. The agony pulsed with every heartbeat. He pressed both hands against his cheek. The pressure offered no relief. Agnes woke. "What is it?" He could barely answer. The pain radiated toward his ear. His eye watered uncontrollably. Even breathing seemed to worsen the sensation. Hours crawled past. Sleep became impossible. By dawn, he looked exhausted. His face had begun swelling. Agnes stared silently. The swelling frightened her. In medieval Europe, infections represented genuine danger. A tooth problem could become something much worse. There were no antibiotics waiting to save patients. An infection spreading through the body sometimes ended lives. Thomas finally accepted reality. He needed help. The next market day occurred 3 days later. A traveling tooth drawer was rumored to be visiting the town of Weatherford. The man supposedly removed troublesome teeth for a fee. Nobody knew much else about him. His reputation rested mostly upon rumor, which in medieval medicine often counted as sufficient evidence. 3 mornings later, Thomas rose before sunrise. The swelling remained visible. Pain still pulsed beneath the surface. Agnes handed him a small pouch containing coins. Not many, just enough. He kissed his children goodbye, then stepped into the freezing darkness. Ahead waited a 15-mile journey, and somewhere at the end of that journey sat a stranger carrying iron tools. A stranger who might solve his suffering or create an entirely new nightmare. Thomas adjusted his cloak against the wind and began walking toward Weatherford. The tooth throbbed with every step, and he had no idea that before the week ended, he would experience one of the most terrifying days of his life. Thomas walked for hours beneath a gray winter sky. The road to Weatherford wound through frozen fields and patches of woodland where bare branches creaked in the wind. Frost covered the edges of the path. Every few hundred steps, he found himself touching the swollen side of his face. The pain had changed again. Earlier, it had arrived in sharp bursts. Now it seemed deeper, heavier. A constant pressure lurked beneath the surface, interrupted by sudden pulses that made his eye water. By midday, he could see the market town ahead. Weatherford was larger than Bricewell. Stone buildings stood among timber structures. Merchants crowded the streets. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. Carts rattled over uneven ground. Voices echoed between buildings. Thomas rarely visited places this large. Whenever he did, he felt both curious and uncomfortable. Towns possessed a different rhythm. Everything moved faster. People seemed less familiar. Faces changed constantly. News arrived daily from distant places. For villagers accustomed to the same neighbors year after year, such activity felt strange. He entered through the western road and joined the crowd. Almost immediately, he heard shouting. Not angry shouting, promotional shouting, the sort used by merchants, hopping to attract customers. One man advertised wool. Another sold smoked fish. A woman praised her medicinal herbs, loudly enough for half the town to hear. Somewhere a blacksmith hammered iron. Somewhere else children laughed. Then Thomas noticed a gathering of people near the market square. A small crowd formed a rough circle. Some watched with fascination. Others appeared disturbed. Thomas moved closer. The moment he saw the raised wooden chair in the center, he understood. The tooth drawer had arrived. The practitioner stood beside the chair speaking energetically to potential customers. He appeared to be around 50 years old. Thick gray hair escaped beneath a worn cap. A leather apron hung over his clothing. Various metal instruments dangled from a belt. Even from several yards away, they looked intimidating. Long iron pincers, hooks, probes, tools whose purposes Thomas could not even guess. The man noticed newcomers approaching. Immediately, his voice grew louder. No pain remains forever if the tooth is removed. A few people laughed. Others nodded. The practitioner lifted a small wooden box. Inside lay several extracted teeth. Thomas stared uneasily. Human teeth. Dozens of them. Perhaps hundreds. Some looked healthy. Others appeared blackened and damaged. The collection served as advertising, evidence of experience, or at least evidence that many extractions had occurred. Whether all patients survived comfortably afterward remained impossible to know. A young laborer occupied the chair. The man looked nervous, very nervous. The tooth drawer examined his mouth briefly. The inspection lasted less than a minute. Then he selected an iron instrument. Thomas watched carefully. The procedure that followed would remain vivid in his memory for the rest of his life. No anesthetic was offered. No numbing agent. No preparation beyond a few words. Two assistants held the patient steady. The laborer gripped the chair tightly. tooth drawer inserted the instrument. Twisted, pulled, the scream echoed across the square. Several children immediately covered their ears. Some spectators winced. Others continued watching with fascination. The practitioner maintained his grip. Another twist, another pull, more screaming. Then suddenly, the tooth came free. Blood followed. The patient slumped back, breathing heavily. The entire procedure lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Yet those 20 seconds looked horrifying. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. The crowd murmured. A few people congratulated the laborer. Others inspected the extracted tooth. The patient staggered away, clutching a cloth against his mouth. The tooth drawer smiled. Next, Thomas considered leaving. The idea appeared increasingly attractive. Perhaps the pain would improve on its own. Perhaps another remedy existed. Perhaps a sudden pulse shot through his jaw. The swelling throbbed violently. His thoughts stopped. No, the problem was not disappearing. He stepped forward. The practitioner looked him over. Tooth. Thomas nodded. The man gestured toward the chair. Sit. There was something unsettling about the speed of the interaction. No detailed discussion. No careful medical history. No lengthy examination. Merely a direct movement toward treatment. Yet such simplicity was common. Medieval medicine often relied upon experience, observation, and practical action, rather than systematic diagnosis. The tooth drawer leaned closer. He smelled faintly of smoke and wine. Which one? Thomas pointed. The practitioner opened his mouth, pressed against several teeth. When he touched the damaged molar, pain exploded instantly. Thomas flinched. The man nodded. That one. His certainty offered little comfort. Can it be saved? Thomas asked. The practitioner laughed. Not cruelly, simply as though the question itself sounded unusual. Saved? He shook his head. Friend, if it has brought you here, it wishes to leave. Several nearby spectators chuckled. Thomas did not. He swallowed. Will it hurt? More laughter. This time, even the assistants joined in. The practitioner patted his shoulder. Only briefly. Somehow, that answer felt worse than no answer at all. Coins changed hands. The fee represented several days of labor. Thomas hated spending the money, yet the pain left little choice. The chair awaited. He sat. Immediately, he noticed scratches carved into the wooden arms. Hundreds of scratches. Deep grooves created by nervous hands. Other patients had sat here. Many other patients. The realization provided no reassurance. The practitioner selected a pair of iron forceps. Thomas stared at the instrument. It looked enormous, far too large for a human mouth. Hold still. One assistant moved behind the chair. Another stood nearby. Thomas's heart began pounding. Every instinct urged him to stand and walk away. Yet he remained seated. tooth drawer positioned the forceps carefully. Metal touched tooth. Pressure increased. For one brief second, nothing happened. Then the pulling began. Pain exploded through Thomas's skull. Not ordinary pain. Not even the worst toothache he had previously experienced. This felt different, immediate, violent, overwhelming, a raw force that erased every other thought. He shouted. The assistant tightened his grip. The practitioner twisted. Something cracked. Thomas could not tell whether the sound came from the tooth or his imagination. Tears streamed from his eyes. Another pull followed. Agony flashed through his jaw. Then suddenly, everything changed. Resistance vanished. The forceps moved backward. The practitioner stepped away, holding the tooth. It was over, or at least the extraction itself was over. Thomas sat motionless. Blood filled his mouth. The world seemed strangely distant. Sounds reached him as if from far away. The crowd appeared blurry. For several moments, he simply breathed. Slowly, carefully, eventually, the practitioner showed him the extracted tooth. The sight was shocking. The crown looked damaged. Dark decay covered part of the surface. Even Thomas, possessing no medical training whatsoever, could tell the tooth had been diseased. The practitioner seemed pleased. There is your enemy. Thomas managed a weak nod. Cloth was pressed against the wound. Instructions followed. Avoid disturbing the area. Rinse carefully. Allow healing. The advice was simple, perhaps too simple, yet that was often the extent of post-operative care. Modern expectations regarding sterile procedures, detailed recovery plans, and follow-up visits belonged centuries in the future. Thomas left the square feeling exhausted. His jaw ached. Blood continued seeping slowly. Yet one thing surprised him. The deep pressure that had haunted him for months seemed reduced. Not gone entirely, but diminished. For the first time in many weeks, he felt a small sense of hope. He rented space on the floor of a crowded inn for the night. The journey home felt too long to attempt immediately. That evening, he sat beside the fire sipping broth. Speaking remained uncomfortable. Eating remained difficult. Still, compared with the infection-driven agony of previous days, the discomfort seemed manageable. Other travelers shared stories. One merchant discussed rising wool prices. Another complained about road conditions. A carpenter described work on a church roof. Life continued normally around him. Thomas listened quietly, occasionally touching his jaw, reassuring himself the damaged tooth was truly gone. Before sleeping, he glanced around the room. Dozens of strangers rested nearby. Some snored, some whispered, some stared into the flames. Medieval travel often involved sharing sleeping spaces with complete strangers. Privacy remained a luxury few could afford. Eventually, Thomas drifted into uneasy sleep. He expected healing. He expected recovery. He expected the worst part of the ordeal to be behind him. Unfortunately, medieval medicine possessed a habit of surprising people, and as Thomas slept beside the dying fire, a problem was already beginning to develop inside the wound left by the extraction, a problem that neither he nor the tooth drawer had noticed. By the following evening, Thomas would discover that removing a tooth was sometimes only the beginning of the nightmare. The following morning, Thomas awoke before sunrise. At first, he felt encouraged. The throbbing pain that had tormented him for months was gone. The diseased tooth no longer sat buried inside his jaw. For a few moments, lying on the inn floor among sleeping travelers, he believed the ordeal had ended. Then he tried opening his mouth. A sharp sting answered immediately. Thomas winced. The extraction site remained tender. That was expected. After all, a tooth had been forcibly removed from his jaw only the previous day. Some discomfort seemed unavoidable. He sat up slowly. The common room smelled of smoke, damp wool, stale ale, and wet boots. A servant added wood to the fire. Nearby, a merchant snored loudly enough to wake several other guests. Thomas touched his cheek. The swelling appeared slightly reduced. That felt promising. He packed his belongings and began the long walk home. The winter sky remained overcast. Cold wind swept across the countryside. The journey felt tiring, but manageable. Several miles passed without incident. Then, sometime during the afternoon, he noticed something strange. The wound felt warmer. Not outside. Inside. A deep warmth beneath the gum. He paused beside a stone wall, pressed his tongue carefully toward the empty socket. The area felt swollen. Perhaps that was normal. He had never had a tooth removed before. How could he know what healing was supposed to feel like? So he continued walking. By evening, the warmth had become a dull ache. Not terrible, not yet, but noticeable. When Thomas finally reached Bricewell after dark, Agnes opened the door with relief. "You returned." Thomas smiled weakly. "As you can see." She examined his face. "The swelling is less." It seems so. Their children gathered nearby. Curious, concerned, Thomas showed them the gap where the tooth had once been. The children reacted with equal parts fascination and horror. For a few minutes, everyone laughed. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in weeks. Dinner consisted of cabbage stew and coarse bread softened in broth. Thomas ate slowly, carefully. The extraction site remained sensitive, yet compared to the agony he had endured before, the discomfort seemed minor. That night, he slept better than he had in months. Not perfectly, but better. The next morning, however, brought unwelcome changes. The ache remained. Instead of fatting, it had grown stronger. Thomas noticed it immediately. A faint throbbing lurked beneath the gum. His jaw felt stiff. The area surrounding the wound appeared irritated. Again, he tried to remain optimistic. Healing required time. Surely that was all. He spent the day repairing fencing with his father. Physical labor distracted him. For several hours, he barely thought about the wound. Then evening arrived. The ache intensified. By bedtime, the throbbing had become impossible to ignore. Agnes noticed his expression. The pain has returned. A little. Her face tightened. That answer worried her. Both understood what infection could mean. Throughout medieval Europe, infections represented one of humanity's greatest enemies. People survived injuries only to die from wounds that became infected afterward. Cuts, broken bones, animal bites, surgical procedures, even minor injuries, sometimes produced deadly consequences. Nobody understood bacteria. Nobody knew about microorganisms. The causes remained mysterious, yet the results were obvious. Redness, swelling, fever, death. Thomas hoped he was imagining things. Unfortunately, the following day removed all doubt. He awoke shivering. The room felt unusually cold. Then he realized the problem. The cold came from inside him. His body trembled despite the fire. His muscles ached. His head felt heavy. Agnes touched his forehead. Her expression changed instantly. "You have a fever." Thomas knew it too. He had seen enough sickness throughout his life to recognize the signs. A fever following a dental extraction was not a welcome development. By midday, he could barely concentrate on work. The wound pulsed continuously. His cheek had begun swelling again. Fear returned. The same fear that had driven him to seek treatment in the first place. Except now the source of danger was no longer the rotten tooth. The source was whatever remained behind. Word spread quickly through the village. Neighbors offered opinions. They always did. One woman recommended crushed onions. Another suggested rosemary. Someone proposed saltwater rinses. A shepherd claimed that sleeping with a heated stone against the jaw would draw out evil humors. An elderly farmer advised placing honey directly into the wound. Some remedies were harmless. Others probably worsened matters. The difficulty lay in knowing which was which. Medical knowledge in the medieval world existed as a mixture of observation, tradition, superstition, practical experience, religious belief, and ancient theories passed down through generations. Certain treatments occasionally helped. Others did nothing. Some caused additional harm. Distinguishing between them proved difficult. Thomas tried several suggestions. The fever remained. The swelling increased. 3 days after the extraction, pus began draining from the socket. Even without scientific understanding, everyone recognized this as a bad sign. Agnes stared at the cloth he used to wipe his mouth. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, she asked the question both feared. "Should we fetch someone?" Thomas sighed. "Who?" It was the same problem as before. Professional medical help remained scarce. The village possessed no physician, no surgeon, no dentist. The nearest trained practitioner lived many miles away. Even then, training varied enormously. Some practitioners inherited knowledge through apprenticeships. Others learned from experience. A few studied ancient medical texts. Many relied upon combinations of all three. The wealthiest people sometimes consulted university-trained physicians. Ordinary peasants rarely enjoyed such opportunities. Still, Thomas's condition appeared increasingly serious. The village priest, Father Matthew, visited that evening. He was a practical man. Not every medieval priest focused exclusively upon spiritual matters. Many served as advisors, record keepers, teachers, and occasional sources of medical knowledge. Father Matthew examined the swollen jaw, the fever, the wound. Then he frowned. "I do not like this." Neither did Thomas. The priest considered carefully. "There is a surgeon in Northbridge." Thomas recognized the name. Northbridge sat nearly 20 miles away, larger than Weatherford, smaller than a city, yet significant enough to support specialized trades. "Can he help?" Father Matthew hesitated. An honest hesitation, not the sort designed to provide false comfort. Perhaps, a dangerous word, yet better than nothing. The following morning, arrangements began. Travel while sick was unpleasant. Travel during winter while sick was worse. Still, remaining home seemed increasingly risky. Thomas's fever continued rising. His appetite vanished. The swelling stretched from his jaw toward his neck. Neighbors helped organize transportation. A local farmer offered space in a cart heading partway toward Northbridge. Agnes packed supplies. Their children watched silently, too young to understand every detail, old enough to sense something was wrong. Before sunrise, Thomas kissed them goodbye. The gesture felt heavier than usual. Medieval people lived close to mortality. Deaths occurred frequently. Disease, accidents, childbirth, famine, infection. Life offered few guarantees. Even so, leaving home while seriously ill always carried emotional weight. The cart rolled slowly across frozen roads. Every bump jarred Thomas's jaw. Pain accompanied each mile. His fever worsened. Sometimes he drifted into half-sleep. Sometimes he stared blankly across snowy fields. Hours blended together. Near evening, Northbridge finally appeared on the horizon. Stone walls surrounded portions of the town. Church towers rose above rooftops. Smoke drifted into the fatting sky. For Thomas, it looked almost like a distant fortress. Somewhere inside lived the surgeon Father Matthew had mentioned, a man whose skills might save him, or might fail entirely. The farmer helped him down from the cart. Thomas swayed slightly. Weakness spread through his limbs. Walking felt difficult. Yet he forced himself onward. Eventually, they reached a narrow building near the marketplace. A wooden sign hung outside. Upon it appeared the image of a bleeding arm, the traditional symbol associated with many medieval surgeons and barber-surgeons. Thomas stared at the sign. Behind that door waited another chapter of medieval medicine, another collection of unfamiliar instruments, another practitioner whose methods would seem terrifying to future generations. He took a deep breath, then stepped inside, and what he discovered within the surgeon's workshop would make the tooth drawer's iron forceps seem almost gentle by comparison. The workshop smelled of vinegar, smoke, herbs, sweat, and something else Thomas could not immediately identify. Something metallic, something unpleasant. The moment he crossed the threshold, he understood this was not an ordinary place. Shelves lined the walls. Jars stood everywhere. Bundles of dried plants hung from ceiling beams. A wooden table occupied the center of the room. Nearby sat a collection of tools: knives, saws, hooks, needles, iron instruments whose purpose Thomas could not guess. He suddenly wished he had not looked too closely. A young apprentice noticed him first. The boy appeared no older than 16. He glanced toward Thomas's swollen face and immediately called into the back room. Master Edmund. Footsteps followed. A broad-shouldered man emerged through a curtain. His beard showed streaks of gray. Deep lines marked his face. His hands looked powerful, not the hands of a scholar, the hands of a man accustomed to physical work, which in truth many surgeons were. Medieval surgery demanded strength as much as knowledge. Master Edmund studied Thomas carefully. Years of experience seemed to sharpen his gaze. He noticed the swelling, the fever, the exhaustion, the unhealthy color of his skin. "Sit down." Thomas obeyed. No unnecessary conversation followed. The surgeon approached and examined the extraction site. His fingers pressed gently against the jaw, then less gently. Thomas flinched. Edmund nodded grimly. How long ago was the tooth removed? 4 days. By whom? A traveling tooth drawer. The surgeon's expression revealed nothing. Yet Thomas sensed the answer was unsurprising. Many difficult cases likely arrived after treatment elsewhere. Edmund leaned back. "You have infection." Thomas already suspected as much. Hearing it confirmed brought little comfort. "Can it be treated?" The surgeon remained silent for several moments, not because he wished to frighten his patient, because he was thinking. Medieval practitioners often relied heavily upon direct observation. They possessed limited tools, limited theories, limited treatment options. Success frequently depended upon experience and judgment. Finally, Edmund spoke. "It may be treated." Thomas felt a small wave of relief. Then the surgeon continued. "If we act quickly." The relief vanished almost immediately. The apprentice brought a candle closer. Edmund examined the jaw again. He pressed near the swollen area beneath Thomas's cheek. Pain exploded instantly. Thomas gasped. The surgeon nodded. There. The apprentice swallowed visibly. That reaction alone worried Thomas. "What is it?" he asked. Edmund answered plainly. "The infection is trapped." Thomas frowned. He did not fully understand. The surgeon noticed. Pus gathers inside. Pressure builds, if it remains. He paused. The consequences may become serious. Serious, another word medieval people learned to fear. It often stood between illness and death. Thomas glanced at the instruments on the nearby table. A terrible suspicion began forming. What must be done? Edmund looked toward the apprentice, then toward the tools, finally back toward Thomas. "We must open it." Silence followed. Thomas stared. The meaning became clear very quickly. Open it. Drain the infection. Thomas felt his stomach tighten. With what? Edmund gestured toward a knife. Not a large knife. Not a sword-like instrument. Yet certainly large enough for the purpose. Thomas suddenly missed the tooth drawer. At least tooth extraction had been brief. This sounded different. Much different. The surgeon must have recognized his fear. "You wish the fever gone." Thomas nodded. "You wish the swelling reduced." Another nod. Then the infection must leave. The logic proved difficult to argue with. Unfortunately, understanding the necessity of a procedure did not make it less frightening. Preparations began immediately. There would be no scheduling an appointment weeks later. No return visit after careful planning. Medical care in the medieval world often happened whenever opportunity and necessity aligned. The apprentice arranged supplies, clean cloths, bowls, heated water, additional candles. Edmund sharpened a blade. The sound alone made Thomas uncomfortable. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Each movement against the whetstone seemed louder than the last. His pulse quickened. Fever already weakened him. Fear finished the task. The surgeon noticed. Drink. He handed Thomas a cup. Wine. Strong wine. Not because it would eliminate pain. It would not. But alcohol occasionally helped calm nerves. Thomas drank. The warmth spread through his body. A second cup followed, then a third. By modern standards, this hardly qualified as anesthesia. By medieval standards, it was among the more practical options available. The procedure began shortly afterward. Thomas sat in a sturdy chair. 2 assistants stood nearby. The apprentice positioned himself beside the surgeon. Everyone seemed prepared. Everyone except Thomas. Edmund spoke calmly. "Remain still." Easier said than done. The surgeon located the swollen area beneath the jaw. Then he positioned the blade. Thomas closed his eyes. For one brief moment, he considered fleeing, standing, running, escaping into the street. Then common sense intervened. Running from infection rarely solved infection. The blade touched skin. A sharp sting followed. Then another. Then pressure. Deep pressure. Thomas gripped the chair arms so tightly, his knuckles turned white. The sensation intensified. Not unbearable. Not yet. Then the incision deepened. Agony flashed through his jaw and neck. He shouted. One assistant steadied him. Edmund continued working. Focused, precise, experienced. Moments later, something changed. Pressure suddenly released. The relief felt immediate. Strain, unexpected, pain remained. Yet beneath it lay a sensation of release. The trapped swelling had found an exit. Edmund nodded with satisfaction. More cloths appeared. More cleaning followed. The procedure lasted several minutes, much longer than the tooth extraction. Yet eventually, the surgeon stepped back. Good. Thomas sat breathing heavily. Sweat covered his forehead. His hands trembled. The apprentice handed him water. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Edmund began explaining recovery. Rest, fluids, cleaning the wound, observation, most importantly, watching whether the fever improved. The next day would reveal much. Thomas spent the night in a rented room nearby. Sleep arrived in fragments. Fever dreams interrupted rest repeatedly. Sometimes he imagined the tooth drawer's iron forceps. Sometimes he saw the surgeon's blade. Sometimes he dreamed of teeth falling endlessly onto stone floors. Morning arrived slowly, very slowly. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, something felt different. Not perfect, certainly not healthy, but different. The crushing pressure had lessened. His jaw still hurt, yet the terrible tightness beneath the swelling seemed reduced. He touched his forehead. The fever remained, though perhaps weaker. Hope returned cautiously. The following day brought further improvement. Small improvements, yet unmistakable ones. He managed a little food. His strength increased slightly. The swelling began retreating. Edmund examined him again. This time, the surgeon appeared more pleased. Your body fights well. Thomas almost laughed. His body had done all the fighting. The surgeon merely provided an opening. Yet perhaps that was exactly the point. Medieval practitioners often could not cure the body. Instead, they attempted to help nature do the work itself. Sometimes that succeeded. Sometimes it failed. Thomas appeared fortunate. For several more days, he remained in Northbridge recovering. During that time, he observed the workshop frequently. What he witnessed fascinated and horrified him in equal measure. Patients arrived constantly. A mason with a crushed finger, a merchant suffering from a leg wound, a farmer with an infected cut, a laborer requiring bloodletting, another needing a damaged tooth removed. Each case revealed another glimpse into medieval healthcare. Some treatments seemed surprisingly practical. Others looked terrifying. All reflected the limits of contemporary knowledge. One afternoon, Thomas watched a man enter complaining of severe tooth pain. The sight immediately captured his attention. The patient looked much like Thomas had looked only weeks earlier. Swollen cheek, sleepless eyes, constant discomfort. Edmund examined him briefly, then prepared extraction tools. The man grew visibly nervous. Thomas understood completely, yet what happened next surprised him. The surgeon paused. He asked questions, several questions, about symptoms, about duration, about swelling, about fever. It was a more careful examination than Thomas had witnessed in the marketplace, not because Edmund possessed modern knowledge. He did not, but because experience had taught caution. Thomas watched thoughtfully. The difference between practitioners suddenly became obvious. Some relied upon speed. Others relied upon observation. Some accumulated wisdom through decades of work. Others merely repeated procedures. In an age without formal standards, outcomes often depended heavily upon the individual performing the treatment. That realization stayed with him. A skilled practitioner could mean survival. An unskilled one could mean disaster. As winter storms continued outside Northbridge's walls, Thomas recovered slowly. He believed the worst was finally behind him. He believed he would soon return home. He believed the nightmare begun by a single rotten tooth was finally ending. Unfortunately, medieval life rarely moved in straight lines, and before Thomas could leave Northbridge, he would witness a dental procedure so shocking that he would remember it until his dying day. A procedure that revealed exactly why so many people feared medieval dentistry more than almost any other form of treatment. The storm arrived during the night. Wind battered the rooftops of Northbridge. Snow drifted through narrow streets and gathered against doors. By morning, much of the town appeared wrapped in white. Thomas stood near the window of his rented room, watching flakes swirl through the gray air. For the first time in many days, he felt almost human again. The fever had weakened considerably. The swelling continued shrinking. His strength slowly returned. He still spoke carefully and avoided hard foods, but the worst symptoms appeared to be fatting. Master Edmund seemed pleased with the progress. Another few days, the surgeon said, and you may return home. Thomas welcomed the news. He missed Agnes. He missed his children. He even missed the repetitive routine of village life. After weeks of pain, travel, procedures, and uncertainty, ordinary days sounded wonderful. Yet fate had one more lesson waiting. Late that morning, a commotion erupted downstairs. Voices echoed through the workshop. Someone shouted. The apprentice hurried toward the entrance. Thomas glanced through the doorway. Several men were helping an older farmer into the building. The man appeared to be around 60 years old. His face was pale. His clothing was covered with melted snow. One hand clutched his jaw. The sight looked familiar, very familiar. Master Edmund approached immediately. What happened? The farmer struggled to answer. His speech sounded strange, muffled, as if his mouth would not open properly. One of the men accompanying him explained. Tooth pain, months of it, worse now. The surgeon nodded. He had likely heard similar stories hundreds of times. The farmer sat heavily in a chair. Thomas watched from across the room, perhaps because his own experience remained fresh, perhaps because he felt curious, or perhaps because observing another person's suffering somehow helped him understand his own. The examination began. Edmund looked inside the farmer's mouth. The result clearly concerned him. He examined again, then again. The farmer groaned. The surgeon finally stepped back. How long has it been this bad? The answer came slowly. Nearly a year. A year. Thomas felt astonished. He had endured months before seeking help. This man had suffered for an entire year. The farmer continued speaking. At first the pain had come and gone. Then it became constant. Recently, he could barely sleep. Eating had become difficult. One side of his face hurt continuously. Thomas knew the pattern well. A story repeated countless times across medieval Europe. Small problem, ignored problem, growing problem, serious problem. The surgeon asked another question. Why wait so long? The farmer laughed bitterly, not because anything was funny, because the answer seemed obvious, because I did not wish to lose the tooth. Edmund nodded. Many patients felt the same way. A tooth once removed could not be replaced. Modern dentures existed only in very primitive forms. Most ordinary people simply lived with missing teeth. Every extraction represented a permanent loss. The examination continued. Eventually, Edmund made his decision. The tooth had to come out. The farmer closed his eyes. Thomas recognized the expression immediately. Resignation, pure resignation. The moment when a person accepts something unpleasant because alternatives appear worse. Preparations began. This time, however, Thomas stood close enough to observe details he had missed during his own ordeal. The surgeon selected a specialized instrument. It resembled forceps, yet not exactly. The jaws curved differently. The design reflected centuries of practical experimentation. Tools evolved slowly. Practitioners modified them over generations. Some improvements spread. Others disappeared. The farmer accepted a cup of wine, then another. His hands trembled slightly. No one mocked him. Everyone understood. Fear in such circumstances required no explanation. The procedure began. At first, everything seemed normal. The instrument gripped the damaged tooth. Pressure increased. The farmer groaned. The surgeon adjusted his position. then pulled. Nothing happened. The tooth remained in place. Edmund frowned. He tried again. More pressure, more force. Still nothing. The tooth refused to move. Thomas sensed tension growing. This differed from his own extraction. His diseased molar had eventually yielded. This one appeared determined to remain where it was. The surgeon paused, examined the tooth again, then attempted a different angle. The farmer cried out. The assistants held him steady. Another pull followed. A terrible cracking sound echoed through the room. Everyone froze. For one horrifying moment, silence dominated the workshop. Then Edmund slowly lowered the instrument. Something had gone wrong. Very wrong. The farmer looked confused. The surgeon looked concerned. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. Edmund inspected the instrument. Part of the tooth remained attached. Only part. The crown had broken away. The roots remained buried inside the jaw. The room grew quiet. Even Thomas, possessing little medical knowledge, understood the problem. Removing a whole tooth was difficult. Removing fragments buried beneath the gum sounded far worse. The farmer seemed to understand as well. His face drained of color. What does that mean? Edmund answered honestly. The roots remain. A pause followed. Then the inevitable question. Can they stay? The surgeon shook his head. No. The single word felt heavy. Thomas watched the farmer's shoulders slump. Whatever came next would undoubtedly be unpleasant. The surgeon selected additional instruments. Smaller ones, narrower ones, more specialized. Hooks, elevators, thin metal tools designed for difficult extractions. Thomas suddenly appreciated how much dental work depended upon brute force combined with experience. There were no machines, no x-rays, no detailed images showing hidden structures beneath the gums. Everything relied upon touch, sight, and judgment. The second phase of the procedure began. It looked far worse than the first. The surgeon worked patiently. Carefully, the farmer gripped the chair so tightly his fingers shook. Pain etched itself across every feature of his face. Minutes passed. Long minutes. The room remained tense. At last, one fragment emerged. Blood followed. Then another fragment. Eventually, the final root came free. The procedure ended successfully. Yet success felt like a relative term. The farmer appeared exhausted. Sweat soaked his clothing. His breathing remained uneven. Thomas felt sympathy and gratitude. His own extraction suddenly seemed comparatively straightforward. Afterward, while the patient recovered, Thomas asked the apprentice a question. Does this happen often? The young man nodded. More than people think. He glanced toward the tray, holding the extracted fragments. Bad teeth break. The explanation sounded simple, yet the consequences clearly were not. The apprentice continued. Some teeth emerged cleanly, others shattered, Some patients arrived before major damage occurred. Others waited until decay weakened everything. Every case differed. The conversation drifted toward dental care in general. The apprentice had learned much from years assisting the surgeon. He explained that many people believed toothaches came from tiny worms living inside teeth. Thomas had heard similar claims before. The idea sounded strange, yet it remained surprisingly common across Europe and beyond. Various cultures embraced versions of the toothworm theory. Without microscopes or modern science, people searched for explanations that made sense within their understanding of the world. A worm seemed as plausible as anything else. Some treatments specifically targeted these imaginary creatures. Smoke therapies, herbal mixtures, various strange remedies. The apprentice described one treatment involving fumes directed into the mouth, another involving heated seeds. Thomas listened with fascination. Human beings had always attempted to explain suffering, even when explanations proved incorrect. The afternoon passed slowly. Snow continued falling outside. Patients came and went. The workshop remained busy. Then, shortly before sunset, another visitor arrived. Unlike most patients, this man wore expensive clothing. Fine wool, well-made boots, a cloak trimmed with fur, clearly wealthier than the average farmer. His arrival attracted attention immediately. The man spoke quietly with Master Edmund. Money changed hands, considerably more money than Thomas had paid. Then something unusual happened. The surgeon retrieved a small pouch from a locked chest. Thomas had never seen it before. The apprentice noticed his curiosity. "What is that?" The young man lowered his voice. "Something special." Thomas frowned. "Special how?" The apprentice glanced toward the wealthy visitor, then back toward Thomas. "Sometimes rich patients pay for things others cannot." The answer raised more questions than it answered. Thomas watched closely. The surgeon opened the pouch. Inside lay several dark pieces of material. Herbs, perhaps, or something similar. Edmund prepared a mixture. The wealthy patient sat in the chair. A dental procedure seemed imminent, yet this one would differ dramatically from anything Thomas had witnessed so far, and what he was about to see would reveal one of the few advantages wealth could purchase when facing the horrors of medieval dentistry. The wealthy visitor settled carefully into the chair. Unlike many patients Thomas had seen, he did not appear terrified. Concerned, certainly. Uncomfortable, without question, but not terrified. That alone distinguished him from most people who entered Master Edmund's workshop with a dental problem. The surgeon continued preparing the strange mixture. The apprentice moved closer to assist. Thomas watched with growing curiosity. The contents of the pouch were crushed inside a small mortar. Additional ingredients followed. A dark liquid, several dried herbs, something with a bitter smell that that immediately filled the room. The wealthy man wrinkled his nose. "Will it work?" Master Edmund gave a measured answer. "It may help." Thomas noticed something important. The surgeon had not promised relief, only possibility. That seemed typical of experienced practitioners. Years of medical work often taught caution. Overconfidence could become dangerous. The mixture eventually became a thick paste. The surgeon applied part of it near the affected tooth. The patient sat quietly. Several minutes passed. Then more time passed. The procedure had not yet begun. Thomas found the delay unusual. Most dental treatments he had witnessed involved immediate action. This seemed different. The apprentice noticed his expression. "He is waiting." "For what?" "The herbs." Thomas understood, at least partly. Throughout the medieval world, practitioners experimented with substances intended to dull pain. Some worked slightly, others hardly worked at all. A few could be genuinely dangerous, yet the desire to reduce suffering remained universal. Surgeons, physicians, healers, and patients all searched for ways to make procedures more bearable. Complete anesthesia remained centuries away, but attempts existed. Some mixtures contained opium, others used mandrake. Henbane appeared in certain preparations. Alcohol remained common. Results varied enormously. Dosage remained difficult. Safety remained uncertain. Yet wealthy patients occasionally gained access to treatments unavailable to ordinary laborers. Thomas suspected he was witnessing one such case. Eventually, the surgeon examined the patient's mouth again. Any difference? The man considered, then nodded slowly. A little, not much, not enough to eliminate pain, but perhaps enough to justify the expense. The extraction began. Thomas watched carefully. The wealthy man still winced, still groaned, still gripped the chair tightly, yet he appeared less distressed than many previous patients. Whether the mixture truly helped, or whether expectation played a role, remained impossible to know. The procedure concluded successfully. The tooth emerged intact. The patient survived the experience, which in many ways represented the primary goal. Afterward, the man departed. Master Edmund locked the remaining herbs back inside the chest. The apprentice resumed cleaning instruments. Thomas continued thinking about what he had seen. Medieval medicine often reflected social status. Wealth opened doors. Better food, better living conditions, access to skilled practitioners, rare medicines, additional care. None guaranteed health. Kings died. Nobles died. Rich merchants died. Yet money undeniably improved one's chances. Thomas thought of Bracewell. Most villagers, there could never afford such treatments. They accepted whatever help happened to be available. Often that meant enduring pain far longer than they should. As evening approached, another conversation began. A traveling merchant had arrived seeking treatment for a different problem. While waiting, he entertained the workshop with stories gathered during years on the road. Merchants carried more than goods. They carried information, rumors, news, local traditions, strange beliefs. The man soon began discussing teeth, specifically unusual methods people used to treat toothaches. Thomas listened with fascination. One village reportedly tied charms around the neck. Another placed particular stones beneath pillows. Somewhere farther south, people supposedly carried animal teeth for protection. The merchant described prayers, rituals, herbal concoctions, superstitions, endless attempts to control dental pain. Most sounded questionable. Some sounded absurd. Yet Thomas understood the underlying motivation. Toothaches created desperation. Desperate people often tried desperate solutions. History offered countless examples. The merchant eventually shared a story that silenced the room. According to his account, a man in another town had attempted removing his own tooth. Without assistance, without experience, without proper tools, several listeners immediately winced. Thomas certainly did. The merchant described pliers, blood, screaming, failure, then infection. Whether every detail proved accurate hardly mattered. The story sounded believable enough. More importantly, it reflected reality. Many people lacked access to practitioners. When pain became severe, some attempted treating themselves. Results rarely impressed anyone. Master Edmund shook his head. A foolish decision. The merchant shrugged. Pain makes fools of many people. No one argued. The statement felt true. Thomas knew it from personal experience. Months earlier, he would have done almost anything to stop the agony in his jaw. Rational thinking often weakened under constant suffering. Darkness settled outside. Snow continued drifting past the windows. Thomas retired to his room. Sleep arrived quickly. Recovery was finally progressing. His strength improved daily. Home felt closer than ever. The next morning brought encouraging news. The fever had disappeared entirely. Master Edmund examined him carefully, then smiled. It was the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from the surgeon. "You may travel tomorrow." Relief flooded through him. At last, the nightmare appeared finished. He spent much of the day preparing for departure. During those hours, he continued observing the workshop. One particular patient captured his attention. An elderly woman arrived seeking help for multiple missing teeth. Unlike extraction patients, her problem involved eating. She struggled with hard foods. Certain meals had become nearly impossible. The surgeon could offer little. A few crude dental replacements existed during the medieval period, but they remained uncommon and often impractical. Most people simply adapted. They softened food, changed diets, learned new ways to chew. The woman accepted this reality calmly. Her visit lasted only a short time, yet it reminded Thomas of something important. Even successful treatment carried consequences. Losing teeth solved some problems while creating others. Every extraction represented compromise. The afternoon passed quietly. Then, near sunset, Thomas wandered into a nearby tavern for supper. The room buzzed with conversation. Travelers discussed weather. Traders discussed prices. Farmers discussed harvests. Nothing unusual, until one elderly man began telling stories about a famous practitioner he had once encountered. According to the tale, the man traveled between towns performing public extractions. Crowds gathered wherever he appeared. Some came for treatment. Others came purely for entertainment. Thomas found the idea unsettling, yet it reflected a reality of the period. Dental work often occurred in public spaces, market squares, fairs, festivals. People watched, sometimes because they needed treatment themselves, sometimes because human curiosity proved difficult to resist. The storyteller claimed this practitioner advertised his skill by hanging extracted teeth where everyone could see them. Others in the tavern nodded. Similar displays apparently existed elsewhere. Reputation mattered enormously. Practitioners needed evidence of experience. Extracted teeth provided visible proof. Thomas remembered the box displayed by the tooth drawer in Weatherford. Suddenly, it made more sense. The conversation continued late into the evening. Tales mixed with rumors. Facts mixed with exaggeration, as often happened around tavern fires. Eventually, Thomas returned to his lodging. Tomorrow, he would begin the journey home. Tomorrow, he would finally leave Northbridge behind. Before sleeping, he stood by the window. Snow had stopped. Moonlight illuminated the rooftops. The town appeared peaceful, almost beautiful. For a moment, he reflected upon everything that had happened. One small cavity, one neglected tooth, weeks of suffering, travel, fear, surgery, infection, recovery, such an enormous chain of events created by something hidden inside a single molar. The thought felt almost absurd, yet entirely real. He climbed into bed. Tomorrow, if all went well, he would see Agnes and the children again. He would return to ordinary life. He would put this entire ordeal behind him. But as Thomas drifted toward sleep, he could not know that his return to Bricewell would reveal a darker truth about medieval dentistry, a truth extending far beyond his own experience. Because back in the village, another person had developed a toothache, and unlike Thomas, that individual had decided never to seek treatment at all. Thomas left Northbridge shortly after dawn. The sky had finally cleared. Fresh snow sparkled across the countryside. For the first time in many weeks, the journey felt hopeful rather than frightening. His body remained tired. His jaw still carried reminders of everything that had happened. Yet he was alive. The fever was gone. The infection had retreated. The worst seemed finished. A passing farmer heading toward the western villages offered him space in a cart for part of the journey. Thomas accepted gratefully. The road rolled beneath creaking wheels. Frozen fields stretched in every direction. Occasionally, they passed travelers moving between towns. A merchant leading pack animals. A priest on horseback. Laborers carrying tools. Life continued despite winter. By late afternoon, Bricewell finally appeared. The sight filled Thomas with relief. The familiar church tower, the cluster of cottages, the winding river, partially frozen along its banks. Home. His children spotted him first. They came running through the snow. Agnes followed moments later. The reunion was simple. No dramatic speeches. No grand celebration. Most medieval families expressed affection through actions rather than elaborate words. Yet the happiness was obvious. Thomas had left seriously ill. Now he had returned. That alone felt worthy of gratitude. For several days, life slowly resumed its normal rhythm. Thomas rested, helped with lighter tasks, avoided hard foods, allowed his body to continue healing. Neighbors frequently visited. Everyone wanted news. What had happened? Had the surgeon helped? How painful had it been? Was the infection truly gone? Thomas answered patiently, sometimes with humor, sometimes with honesty that made listeners uncomfortable. The story spread quickly. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in Bricewell knew the details. Most reacted the same way. Relief that Thomas survived, fear at the descriptions, and gratitude that the ordeal had not happened to them. Unfortunately, that final feeling would not last. One evening, while sharing a meal with his family, Thomas heard a knock at the door. Outside stood his neighbor, Walter Cooper. Walter was around 50 years old, a hard-working man, broad-shouldered, usually cheerful. Tonight he looked miserable. One side of his face appeared swollen. Thomas immediately recognized the signs. The sight sent a chill through him. Walter stepped inside. Agnes offered him a seat. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Walter sighed heavily. It started 2 months ago. Thomas already knew what it meant. The toothache. Walter pressed a hand against his cheek. At first it came and went. The story sounded painfully familiar. Thomas listened quietly. Walter continued. The pain gradually worsened. Sleep became difficult. Eating became unpleasant. Some days felt tolerable. Others felt unbearable. Again, the pattern matched. Yet one important difference existed. Walter had not sought treatment, nor did he intend to. I heard what happened to you, Walter admitted. Thomas nodded. It was unpleasant. Walter laughed bitterly. Unpleasant. The word clearly felt inadequate. You nearly died. Thomas could not argue completely. The infection had indeed become serious. Walter leaned forward. I would rather keep the tooth. There it was. The same fear, the same calculation countless people made throughout history. Pain versus treatment, risk versus risk, suffering now versus uncertainty later. Human beings often delayed difficult decisions, not because they were foolish, because they were human. Thomas understood better than anyone. Months earlier, he had done exactly the same thing. The conversation continued. Thomas described the consequences of waiting. The infection, the fever, the surgery. Walter listened carefully, yet his expression never changed. Fear remained stronger than persuasion. Eventually, he left, still unwilling to seek help. Thomas watched him disappear into the darkness. A sense of unease lingered. The situation felt familiar, too familiar. Winter deepened. Snowstorms came and went. Days shortened. Nights seemed endless. Life in Bricewell followed its usual course. People worked, prayed, cooked, repaired buildings, prepared for the harshest weeks of the season. Meanwhile, Walter's condition slowly worsened. Everyone noticed. The swelling increased. His mood deteriorated. He spoke less frequently. Sometimes he missed work entirely. Even from a distance, villagers could see something was wrong. Yet Walter remained stubborn. Every suggestion met resistance. Travel to Weatherford. No. Visit Northbridge. No. Consult a surgeon. Absolutely not. He would endure. At least that was the plan. One evening, Thomas encountered him near the village well. The transformation shocked him. Walter looked older, much older, not because years had passed, because suffering had changed him. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His posture seemed weaker. His movements lacked energy. Chronic pain had worn him down. The two men stood quietly for a moment. Then Walter spoke. I cannot sleep anymore. The confession emerged almost as a whisper. Thomas remembered those nights, hours spent staring into darkness, waiting for pain to fade, knowing it would not. Walter rubbed his jaw. Every heartbeat hurts. Again, Thomas remembered. The pulsing agony, the constant pressure, the sense that the pain lived inside the skull itself. Neither man spoke for a while. Finally, Thomas asked a simple question. Why not seek help? Walter stared at the frozen ground. The answer arrived slowly. My brother. Thomas frowned. What about him? Walter swallowed. Several years earlier, his brother had undergone a leg operation after a farming accident. The procedure had gone badly. Infection followed. Death followed after that. The memory remained vivid, powerful, terrifying. Walter associated practitioners with loss, with fear, with failure. Logic alone could not erase such experiences. Thomas suddenly understood. This was not merely stubbornness. It was grief, fear rooted in memory, fear strengthened over years. No easy solution existed. They parted ways shortly afterward. The conversation haunted Thomas. History often describes medical decisions as if they were simple. In reality, people carried personal experiences into every choice. Bad outcomes lingered. Stories spread. Memories influenced behavior, just as they do today. A week later, disaster struck. The village bell rang unexpectedly one afternoon. Not the pattern used for church services, not the signal for meetings. A different tone, an urgent tone. People emerged from homes. Questions filled the air. Thomas soon learned the cause. Walter had collapsed. Neighbors found him unable to stand. His fever burned fiercely. The swelling extended from his jaw down toward his neck. The infection had progressed, exactly as Thomas feared. Father Matthew arrived quickly. Several villagers helped carry Walter home. The scene looked disturbingly familiar. Fever, swelling, weakness, the same chain of events repeating itself. Except this time, the patient had waited much longer. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he spoke clearly. Sometimes he muttered nonsense. The infection had taken hold. A messenger was dispatched toward Weatherford, another toward a nearby village. Anyone who might possess medical knowledge became a potential source of help. Yet winter roads moved slowly. Assistance would not arrive immediately. Thomas stood outside Walter's cottage that evening. Snow fell gently. Smoke drifted from chimneys. The village felt unusually quiet. Everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. Everyone understood the danger. Inside the cottage, Walter fought a battle invisible to the eye. A battle begun months earlier, with nothing more dramatic than a toothache. Thomas thought back to his own experience. The extraction, the infection, the surgeon, the recovery. So many events balanced upon chance. Different timing, different decisions, different outcomes. History often remembered kings, wars, and great events. Yet ordinary lives frequently turned upon smaller moments. A missed harvest, a winter storm, a broken bone, a rotten tooth. As darkness settled across Bricewell, Thomas could not shake a troubling thought. If help failed to arrive soon, Walter's story might end very differently from his own. And before the week was over, the entire village would receive a painful reminder of just how deadly dental problems could become in the medieval world. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow. Bricewell felt unusually subdued. Even the ordinary sounds of village life seemed quieter. People still worked. Animals still required care. Fires still needed tending. Yet conversations repeatedly returned to the same subject. Walter Cooper. Throughout the village, concern continued to grow. Thomas visited the cottage shortly after sunrise. Several neighbors had already gathered. Father Matthew stood near the hearth. Walter's wife, Eleanor, looked exhausted. She had barely slept. Few people in the room spoke above a whisper. The atmosphere felt heavy. Thomas immediately noticed how much Walter had changed. Only days earlier, he had still been walking through the village. Now he lay beneath blankets, pale and drenched with sweat. His breathing seemed shallow. The swelling along his jaw and neck appeared worse than before. The sight reminded Thomas of something Master Edmund had once said. If we act quickly. At the time, those words had sounded serious. Now Thomas understood them even more clearly. Timing mattered. Sometimes it mattered enormously. A local healer had arrived during the night. Not a surgeon, not a physician, simply a woman with years of practical experience treating common ailments. People respected her. She possessed knowledge of herbs, poultices, fevers, and wounds. In many villages across medieval Europe, such individuals served an important role. Formal medicine remained distant for most people. Practical local knowledge often became the first line of defense. The healer examined Walter carefully. She checked his fever, looked at the swelling, listened to his breathing. Then she quietly stepped aside. Her expression revealed enough. The situation was grave. Thomas watched Father Matthew approach her. They spoke softly. The healer eventually shook her head. Not dramatically, simply honestly. She could offer comfort. She could offer support. She could not perform the sort of intervention Walter likely needed. That required someone like Master Edmund, and Master Edmund remained many miles away. The messenger sent toward Weatherford had not yet returned. Winter roads slowed everything. Distance became an enemy. Hours passed. The fever continued. Walter drifted between awareness and confusion. Sometimes he recognized people. Sometimes he did not. His wife remained beside him, almost constantly. Thomas stayed for much of the day, not because he could help. There was little anyone could do. He remained because leaving felt wrong. Many medieval communities operated that way. When hardship arrived, neighbors gathered, not necessarily to solve the problem, sometimes simply to endure it together. As evening approached, the messenger finally returned. The news was disappointing. The tooth drawer who had treated Thomas months earlier was no longer in Weatherford. He had moved on. No one knew exactly where. Traveling practitioners rarely stayed in one location for long. They followed fairs, markets, opportunities. The village had lost one possible source of help. Father Matthew immediately dispatched another messenger, this time toward Northbridge, toward Master Edmund. The journey would take time, more time than anyone wanted to hear. That night, Thomas slept poorly. Memories returned. The throbbing tooth, the fever, the surgery, the fear, all of it felt uncomfortably close. At dawn, he returned to Walter's cottage. Before entering, He already sensed something had changed. The crowd outside looked larger. Faces appeared grim. No one smiled. No one spoke loudly. Thomas stepped through the doorway. Silence greeted him. Walter still lived, but only barely. The infection had advanced further. Breathing looked difficult. Speaking appeared impossible. Even opening his eyes required effort. Alina sat beside him, holding his hand. Her expression revealed exhaustion beyond words. Thomas quietly took a seat nearby. Hours crawled past. Snow continued falling outside. The fire crackled softly. Occasionally, someone whispered a prayer. Occasionally, someone adjusted blankets. Mostly people waited. Waiting became one of the defining experiences of medieval life. Waiting for harvests, waiting for weather, waiting for recovery, waiting for news, waiting for outcomes beyond human control. By midday, Father Matthew arrived carrying a small leather satchel. He sat beside Walter. The priest had known him for years, baptized his children, shared meals, offered guidance, conducted ceremonies. Such relationships formed deep roots in small communities. The two men spoke briefly. Walter's voice barely rose above a whisper. Nobody else heard the words. Perhaps that was intentional. Some conversations belonged only to those involved. When the discussion ended, Father Matthew remained beside him for a long time. The room grew quieter still. Then, shortly before sunset, a sound echoed from outside. Hooves, fast-moving hooves. Everyone turned. A rider approached through the snow. The messenger from Northbridge had returned. Hope surged through the cottage instantly. People rushed toward the door. Questions filled the air. Had he found Master Edmund? Would the surgeon come? Could he help? The answers arrived quickly. Yes, the messenger had found Edmund. Yes, the surgeon understood the seriousness. And yes, he was coming. Relief spread through the room. At last, professional help was on the way. Yet one final detail remained. Edmund would not arrive until the following day. The distance was simply too great. The weather too difficult. The roads too poor. Another night remained. One more night. Thomas watched hope and fear battle across Alina's face. Help existed, but help had not yet arrived. Everyone understood the difference. Darkness settled. Candles flickered. Snow battered the windows. The longest night of the ordeal began. Walter's condition continued deteriorating. Several times, villagers feared the end had come. Several times, he rallied briefly, then weakened again. Time lost meaning. People slept in chairs. Others dozed against walls. Some remained awake entirely. The entire cottage seemed suspended between possibilities. Shortly before dawn, Thomas stepped outside for air. The cold struck immediately. Above him, clouds drifted apart. Stars appeared. The village lay silent beneath the snow. He stood there thinking. about pain, about fear, about decisions, about how many people throughout history faced similar situations. Modern readers often imagine medieval dentistry as little more than crude extractions. Yet the reality reached further. Dental disease influenced lives, families, communities, economies. A single infection could remove a worker from the fields, drain savings, create hardship, or end a life entirely. The consequences extended far beyond the tooth itself. Thomas returned indoors. Walter remained alive. Barely. The waiting continued. Finally, just after sunrise, another sound reached the village. Hooves again, slower this time. Steady, purposeful. The door opened. Cold air swept inside. Then Master Edmund entered the cottage. Snow covered his cloak. His face looked tired from travel, yet his eyes remained alert. Immediately, he moved toward the bed. No wasted motion, no dramatic speeches, no promises, simply action. The surgeon examined Walter carefully. The room watched in complete silence. Every person present understood the importance of the moment. Edmund checked the swelling, felt the jaw, observed the fever, asked questions. Then he stood quietly, thinking, evaluating, judging whether intervention remained possible. The silence stretched. Seconds felt like minutes. Finally, the surgeon turned toward Father Matthew. The expression on his face told Thomas something before a single word was spoken. This would not be simple. In fact, it might already be too late. And the decision Master Edmund made over the next few minutes would become one of the most difficult choices he had faced in many years of treating patients. Master Edmund stood beside the bed for several moments without speaking. The cottage remained silent. Only the crackling fire and Walter's labored breathing disturbed the stillness. Every pair of eyes focused on the surgeon. People searched his face for clues. Hope, concern, confidence, anything. Yet Edmund had spent many years treating difficult cases. He had learned not to speak before thinking, not to promise what he could not guarantee, not to offer certainty where none existed. Finally, he looked toward Father Matthew, then toward Walter's wife. His expression remained serious. The infection is severe. No one appeared surprised. They already knew that much. The surgeon continued. It has spread beyond the tooth. A heavy silence followed. Again, nobody seemed shocked. Walter's swollen face made that obvious. What people wanted to know was something else. Could he still be saved? That question lingered unspoken for several seconds. Then Alina asked it directly. Can you help him? Edmund paused, not because he wished to frighten her, because he intended to answer honestly. Perhaps. The word landed heavily. Thomas remembered hearing that same word weeks earlier in Northbridge. Perhaps. Neither yes nor no. A narrow bridge between hope and uncertainty. The surgeon set down his satchel. Inside rested familiar tools, instruments Thomas recognized from his own treatment. Knives, forceps, cloths, needles, supplies carefully maintained despite years of use. The sight unsettled him because he already suspected what Edmund intended. The surgeon examined Walter's mouth. The process proved difficult. Swelling restricted movement. Pain complicated everything. Still, after several minutes, Edmund reached a conclusion. The diseased tooth remained present, still buried inside the jaw, still serving as the source of infection. Thomas felt a chill. Walter had delayed too long. The tooth that might have been removed months earlier now sat at the center of a far greater problem. Edmund straightened. The tooth must come out. No one argued. No one questioned the decision. The situation had progressed beyond debate. The real concern involved something else. Whether Walter possessed enough strength to survive the procedure. The surgeon clearly understood the risk. He spent considerable time preparing, more than Thomas remembered from his own extraction. Walter's condition demanded caution. The fever had weakened him significantly. Every movement seemed to drain energy. Yet waiting offered little advantage. The infection continued advancing. Action remained the only realistic option. Word spread quickly through Bricewell. Before long, villagers gathered outside the cottage, not because they wished to watch. Most had no desire to witness the procedure. They gathered because they cared, because everyone knew Walter, because small communities often shared burdens collectively. Inside, preparations continued. Alina remained beside her husband. Father Matthew offered quiet support. Thomas assisted where he could. Mostly that meant carrying water, adjusting furniture, helping create space. Simple tasks, yet performing them felt important. Eventually, everything stood ready. The surgeon approached the bed. Walter opened his eyes slowly. The fever had stolen much of his strength, yet enough awareness remained. Enough to understand what was happening. Enough to be afraid. Edmund spoke calmly, explaining the procedure, explaining the risks, explaining the necessity. Walter listened, then nodded weakly. The decision had effectively been made already. Still, the surgeon treated him with respect. That mattered, even in desperate circumstances. The extraction began shortly afterward. Thomas had witnessed dental procedures before, yet this one felt different. The atmosphere alone transformed the experience. This was not a marketplace demonstration, not a public attraction, not a routine appointment. This felt like an attempt to rescue a man, standing dangerously close to death. The surgeon positioned the instrument carefully. The swollen tissue complicated access. Walter groaned softly. His remaining strength seemed limited. Edmund worked with remarkable patience. Years of experience showed in every movement. No wasted effort, no rushing, no hesitation. The room remained completely silent. Then the pulling began. Walter cried out. The sound was weaker than Thomas remembered from his own extraction, not because the procedure hurt less, because illness had exhausted him. The sight proved unsettling. Pain should have produced fury, struggle, resistance. Instead, it produced exhaustion. The surgeon adjusted his grip, pulled again. The tooth resisted. Thomas felt tension spread through the room. Everyone understood what happened when extractions became difficult. The memory of the farmer in Northbridge returned immediately. Broken teeth, complications, more suffering. Edmund remained focused. Another adjustment, another attempt. Seconds stretched. Then suddenly, the tooth shifted. A small movement, yet enough. The surgeon noticed instantly. So did Thomas. Hope flickered. The extraction continued. Slowly, carefully. Then at last, the tooth came free. A collective breath escaped the room. The diseased molar appeared terrible, darkened, damaged, clearly unhealthy. The source of months of misery, the source of the infection threatening Walter's life. Yet no celebration followed. Everyone understood a difficult truth. Removing the tooth did not automatically remove the danger. The infection remained. The fever remained. The damage already done remained. The extraction represented a beginning, not an ending. Edmund knew this better than anyone. His attention immediately shifted elsewhere. The swelling beneath Walter's jaw, the area Thomas remembered all too well. The surgeon examined it carefully, then sighed, not dramatically, simply with the weariness of a man who recognized another difficult procedure approaching. Father Matthew noticed. So, Edmund answered quietly, "There is more." The meaning became clear quickly. The infection required drainage, just as Thomas's had. The room grew tense again. Walter barely possessed the strength for one procedure. Now another awaited. Yet there appeared no alternative. The surgeon prepared additional instruments. Thomas watched silently. Memories flooded back. The blade, the pressure, the relief afterward. He understood exactly what Walter faced. Unfortunately, Walter did not enjoy the same advantages Thomas had possessed. His infection had progressed further. His body had weakened more severely. Everything carried greater risk. The second procedure began. Alina turned away. Several others did the same, not from weakness, from compassion. Watching someone suffer could be difficult, especially someone familiar, especially someone already fragile. Edmund worked steadily. The assistants supported him. The cottage remained silent apart from occasional instructions. Time seemed to slow. Finally, the surgeon stepped back. The procedure had ended. For several moments, nobody moved. Walter lay exhausted. Sweat covered his forehead. His breathing sounded uneven, yet the swelling already appeared slightly different. Pressure had been released. The immediate crisis seemed reduced, at least somewhat. The surgeon cleaned his instruments, then sat quietly, a sign of fatigue rarely visible during procedures. Travel, stress, responsibility all carried weight. Thomas approached cautiously. Will he recover? Edmund stared into the fire before answering. The pause felt long, very long. Then the surgeon spoke. I do not know. Honesty again. Relentless honesty. Thomas respected it, even when he disliked hearing it. The remainder of the day passed slowly. Villagers came and went. Food arrived. Firewood arrived. Support arrived. The community rallied around Walter's family. There was little medicine to offer, but there were other forms of assistance. Practical help, human presence, shared responsibility. Night approached once more. The cottage settled into uneasy quiet. Walter slept, or perhaps drifted in and out of awareness. The distinction proved difficult to determine. The fever remained, though perhaps slightly lower. The swelling remained, though perhaps slightly reduced. Small changes, potentially important changes, or perhaps meaningless ones. Nobody could yet tell. Thomas eventually returned home. For the first time in days, he allowed himself a measure of hope. The procedures had succeeded. The source of infection was gone. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe Walter's body could still recover. Maybe. Yet as Thomas sat beside his own fire later that evening, another realization occurred to him. Everything he had witnessed over recent months revealed something profound about medieval dentistry. The true terror had never been the extraction itself, not the forceps, not the knives, not even the pain. The real terror lay in uncertainty. A simple toothache could become anything. An annoyance, a disability, a financial burden, a life-threatening infection. No one knew which path awaited them, and that uncertainty haunted every person who felt the first small ache inside a tooth. Meanwhile, across the village, Walter Cooper began the longest and most important night of his life. By sunrise, everyone would know whether Master Edmund had arrived in time, or whether medieval dentistry had once again lost its race against infection. The night seemed endless. A cold wind moved across Bricewell, rattling shutters and sending fine snow against cottage walls. Inside Walter Cooper's home, candles burned low. The fire crackled softly. Shadows danced across timber beams. Everyone waited. Waiting had become the defining task. No one could force recovery. No one could command the fever to leave. No one could guarantee that the infection would retreat. The surgeon had done everything available to him. Now the outcome rested largely in the hands of nature. Walter slept fitfully. Sometimes he stirred. Sometimes he muttered fragments of words. At other moments, he lay perfectly still, causing everyone nearby to watch his chest anxiously until the next breath arrived. Alina remained awake most of the night. Father Matthew stayed longer than usual before finally departing for a few hours of rest. Master Edmund sat quietly near the hearth. Thomas, who had returned home earlier, found himself unable to sleep. The memories were too fresh. Every detail from his own illness returned repeatedly. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty. He knew exactly what Walter's family was experiencing. Shortly before dawn, Thomas rose from bed and walked through the snow toward the cottage once again. The village remained silent. Even the animals seemed quieter than normal. As he approached the house, he noticed something encouraging. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. People still moved inside. Hope remained alive. When Thomas entered, he found Master Edmund examining Walter carefully. The surgeon looked tired. His eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had spent years fighting battles against injury, disease, and infection. Yet something about his expression seemed different, not cheerful. Surgeons rarely appeared cheerful while monitoring seriously ill patients, but perhaps slightly less concerned. "How is he?" Thomas asked softly. Edmund glanced toward the bed. "The fever has lowered." The words instantly improved the atmosphere, not because they guaranteed survival, because they represented progress. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. Walter remained weak, very weak, yet his breathing sounded easier. The swelling appeared slightly reduced. The changes were subtle. Someone unfamiliar with the situation might not have noticed them. Those who had watched the illness closely noticed immediately. Throughout the morning, cautious optimism spread. By midday, Walter managed to drink broth, a simple accomplishment, yet everyone treated it like a victory. In many ways, it was. People recovering from serious illness often improved gradually. Tiny steps accumulated. Strength returned slowly. Recovery unfolded over days and weeks rather than hours. The afternoon brought further improvement. Walter remained exhausted, still feverish, still swollen, but undeniably better than the day before. For the first time, Alina smiled. Only briefly, only slightly. Yet Thomas noticed. So did everyone else. Master Edmund remained careful. He refused to celebrate prematurely. Years of experience had taught him that illness sometimes changed direction unexpectedly. Still, even he could not ignore the signs. The infection seemed to be retreating. The following morning provided stronger evidence. Walter woke, fully aware of his surroundings. His voice remained weak, yet he recognized everyone. The confusion had disappeared. The fever continued falling. The crisis appeared to be passing. Relief swept through Bricewell. Not dramatic relief, not cheering, not celebration, simply the gradual release of tension. that had gripped the village for days. Walter had survived. At least, it finally seemed likely. The news spread quickly. People spoke about it in fields, near the well, inside homes, at church, everywhere. And as often happens after danger passes, conversations shifted toward reflection. Many villagers began discussing teeth. More specifically, they began discussing all the tooth problems they had ignored. One man admitted he had suffered occasional pain for years. Another confessed that chewing on one side of his mouth hurt. An elderly woman described several loose teeth. Suddenly, everyone seemed aware of their mouths. The ordeal had reminded them of a simple truth. Dental problems did not always remain dental problems. Sometimes they became much more. Master Edmund stayed several more days before preparing to leave. During that time, he answered countless questions, some practical, some strange, some based on old beliefs and superstitions. The villagers wanted knowledge. They wanted reassurance. Most of all, they wanted certainty. Unfortunately, certainty remained rare. One evening, Thomas sat with the surgeon near a fire. The village had organized a modest meal to thank him. Nothing extravagant. Bricewell possessed little wealth, yet gratitude mattered. The conversation eventually turned toward dentistry. Thomas asked a question that had lingered in his mind for weeks. Have teeth always caused this much trouble? Edmund laughed softly. Long before either of us were born. The surgeon explained that dental pain appeared in ancient writings stretching back centuries. Roman texts mentioned tooth problems. Greek writings discussed treatments. Even older civilizations recorded similar complaints. Throughout history, human beings had suffered from toothaches. The details changed. The tools changed. The theories changed. The suffering remained remarkably consistent. Thomas found that strangely comforting. Not because people suffered, because the experience connected generations. Across centuries, countless individuals had sat awake at night pressing a hand against a painful jaw. Kings, farmers, merchants, priests, everyone. Pain ignored social rank. The discussion continued. Edmund described treatments he had encountered during his travels. Some impressed him, others did not. He spoke of practitioners who worked carefully, others who worked recklessly. Some possessed genuine skill, others possessed only confidence. Thomas listened with fascination. The medieval world lacked standardized medical education. Reputation mattered enormously. Experience mattered even more. Choosing the right practitioner could make an enormous difference. The wrong choice could prove disastrous. Eventually, Thomas asked another question. What is the worst case you have seen? Edmund stared into the fire for several moments. The answer did not arrive immediately. When it finally came, his voice sounded quieter. A young man. Thomas waited. The surgeon continued. Years earlier, a patient had ignored severe dental pain. Just as Walter had, the infection spread, just as Walter's had. By the time help arrived, swelling obstructed breathing. The surgeon paused, then finished the story. The young man died before treatment could begin. Silence followed. No dramatic details. No sensational description. None were necessary. The lesson remained obvious. Dental disease could kill. Not always, not frequently compared with many other medieval dangers, but certainly often enough to command respect. The conversation ended soon afterward, yet the story remained with Thomas. It remained with several others who overheard it as well. Over the following weeks, life gradually returned to normal. Winter slowly loosened its grip. Snow melted. Mud replaced ice. Days grew longer. Walter recovered steadily. The process took time. His strength returned little by little. He lost weight. He tired easily. Yet he lived. Every improvement felt significant. One afternoon, nearly a month after the crisis, Thomas encountered him near the village well. The difference was remarkable. Walter still looked thinner than before, yet the swelling had vanished. The fever had disappeared. His eyes looked clear again. The two men stood together for a moment. Then Walter laughed. It was the first genuine laugh Thomas had heard from him in months. "I should have listened." Thomas smiled. "Probably." Walter shook his head. "Definitely." Neither man needed further explanation. The lesson had become painfully clear. Around them, life continued. Children played nearby. Women carried water. Farmers discussed spring planting. The village moved forward. Yet the memory of the ordeal lingered. It became one of those stories people repeated for years. A warning, a lesson, a reminder. Future toothaches would inevitably be compared against Walter's experience. Future decisions would be influenced by what happened. Human communities often learned through stories, especially stories involving people they knew. And so, as spring approached Bricewell, Thomas believed the chapter had finally ended. He believed the village had returned to peace. He believed his own encounter with medieval dentistry had become nothing more than an unpleasant memory. But beyond Bricewell, beyond the surrounding fields and forests, a far larger world continued turning. A world filled with barber-surgeons, traveling tooth drawers, physicians, herbalists, charlatans, and patients. A world where thousands of people faced the same fears every day. And before long, an unexpected traveler would arrive in the village carrying stories so astonishing that Thomas would begin to understand just how strange, inventive, and occasionally horrifying the wider world of medieval dentistry truly was. Spring arrived slowly. The snow disappeared first. Then the frozen ground softened. Streams began flowing more strongly. Birdsong returned to the countryside. After the hardships of winter, Bricewell seemed almost transformed. Fields that had appeared lifeless only weeks earlier now showed hints of green. Farmers returned to longer days of work. Children spent more time outdoors. The village settled back into its familiar rhythm. For Thomas Weaver, life finally felt normal again. The gap where the extracted tooth had once been remained. Sometimes his tongue drifted toward the empty space without thinking, a small reminder of everything he had endured. Yet the pain was gone. The fever was gone. The fear was gone. Those alone felt like blessings. Walter Cooper continued improving as well. Though thinner than before, he regained strength steadily. The experience had changed him, not dramatically, not in ways obvious to strangers, but Thomas noticed. Walter no longer ignored physical problems. Minor injuries received attention. Persistent discomfort prompted action. The ordeal had taught caution, perhaps even humility. Many people throughout history learned important lessons from suffering. Unfortunately, the education often came at a painful cost. One afternoon, several months after Master Edmund's visit, an unfamiliar traveler arrived in Bricewell. Travelers appeared occasionally. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, wandering craftsmen. Yet this particular visitor immediately attracted attention. He wore clothing unlike most villagers. His cloak displayed signs of long journeys. His boots appeared worn from countless miles. More interestingly, he carried a leather case filled with unusual objects. Before long, curiosity drew people toward him. The traveler introduced himself as Geoffrey. He claimed to have spent years moving between towns, cities, monasteries, and trading centers throughout England and parts of the continent. Whether every detail proved true remained uncertain. Travelers often enjoyed improving their stories. Nevertheless, Geoffrey clearly possessed knowledge of distant places. Villagers listened eagerly. News from beyond their immediate surroundings always attracted interest. During the evening meal at the village alehouse, conversation eventually turned toward health, then toward medicine, then inevitably toward teeth. Walter's ordeal remained fresh in local memory. The subject emerged naturally. Geoffrey laughed when he heard the story, not because he found suffering amusing, because he had heard similar stories countless times. Everywhere I travel, he said, people fear toothaches. Several villagers nodded immediately. Geoffrey continued. Some fear wolves, some fear robbers, some fear war. He raised his cup, but nearly everyone fears a bad tooth. Laughter followed. The statement contained enough truth to feel familiar. As the evening progressed, Geoffrey began sharing stories from his journeys. Thomas listened carefully. Many tales sounded almost unbelievable. Yet Geoffrey spoke with confidence. He described cities where barber-surgeons maintained permanent shops, places where wealthy merchants paid substantial sums for treatment, towns where medical practitioners competed for customers. Villagers found such descriptions fascinating. Their world rarely extended beyond neighboring settlements. Hearing about distant practices felt like peering through a window into another reality. One story especially captured everyone's attention. Geoffrey described a large fair he had visited several years earlier. Among the attractions stood a famous tooth drawer. According to Geoffrey, the man performed extractions before enormous crowds. Music played. Assistants shouted advertisements. Spectators gathered in the hundreds. Thomas frowned. The image sounded strange. Medical treatment mixed with entertainment. Yet Geoffrey insisted it was true. People came from miles away. To have teeth removed, someone asked. Geoffrey grinned. Some did. Laughter spread around the room. Then he added another detail. Others came simply to watch. That statement seemed even stranger. Yet the traveler explained. Public extractions attracted attention precisely because everyone understood the fear involved. Observing another person's courage or terror created a spectacle. Human curiosity remained powerful. It always had been. Geoffrey described practitioners displaying strings of extracted teeth as evidence of experience. Thomas immediately remembered the wooden box carried by the tooth drawer in Weatherford. The image fit perfectly. Reputation needed visible proof. Teeth provided it. The stories continued. Some sounded amusing. Others sounded horrifying. One involved a practitioner who claimed he could remove teeth so quickly patients barely felt pain. Another involved a surgeon famous for treating nobles. A third concerned a traveling healer whose remedies supposedly cured every ailment imaginable. Geoffrey clearly doubted many such claims. Experience had made him skeptical. Whenever someone promises miracles, he said, hold tightly to your purse. The alehouse erupted with laughter. Even Father Matthew smiled. The advice seemed broadly applicable. As the evening wore on, Geoffrey shared a particularly interesting story. Years earlier, while staying near a monastery, he had met a monk responsible for copying ancient texts. Among those texts appeared medical writings, some dated back centuries. The monk reportedly possessed books discussing dental treatments from ancient civilizations. Thomas found this remarkable. Like many villagers, he tended to imagine the past as a simpler version of the present. Geoffrey's story suggested otherwise. People had been studying health problems for generations. Centuries of observation existed. Centuries of attempts. Centuries of failures and occasional successes. The traveler explained that ancient scholars had proposed numerous explanations for tooth pain. Some theories approached reality more closely than others. None fully understood the truth, yet human beings never stopped searching. That determination impressed Thomas. Across time and place, people continued trying to solve the same problems. Another villager asked whether rich people suffered fewer toothaches. Geoffrey laughed immediately. No, more laughter followed. Then he elaborated. Wealth improved many things. Better food, better treatment, better access to skilled practitioners. Yet rich people still possessed teeth. Teeth still decayed. Teeth still broke. Teeth still became infected. Money reduced certain risks. It did not eliminate them. Thomas remembered the wealthy patient he had seen in Northbridge. Even access to expensive herbs had not removed pain entirely. The observation seemed accurate. The discussion stretched late into the night. Geoffrey proved an excellent storyteller. His tales mixed humor, experience, and practical wisdom. Villagers listened eagerly. For people accustomed to local concerns, such stories offered entertainment and education simultaneously. Eventually, the conversation shifted toward unusual remedies. Here Geoffrey truly captured everyone's attention. He described treatments from various regions. Some sounded reasonable. Herbal rinses, medicinal poultices, warm compresses. Others sounded utterly bizarre. Charms, rituals, strange objects carried for protection. Elaborate ceremonies intended to drive away imaginary toothworms. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. Geoffrey only laughed. People become creative when they hurt. That explanation felt difficult to dispute. Pain encouraged experimentation. Sometimes useful experimentation. Sometimes not. The traveler then mentioned something unexpected. During his journeys, he had encountered a physician who attempted to preserve damaged teeth rather than immediately remove them. The room grew quiet. Even Thomas leaned forward. Preserve them. The concept sounded unusual. Extraction dominated nearly every dental story villagers knew. Geoffrey nodded. The physician believed some teeth might survive if treated early. His methods remained limited. His success inconsistent. Yet the idea fascinated Thomas. It suggested alternatives, small glimpses of approaches that would become more common centuries later. The traveler admitted most practitioners still preferred removal. A painful tooth could not hurt if it no longer existed. The logic remained difficult to challenge. Yet hearing about different ideas reminded everyone that medicine continued evolving. Slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, but evolving nonetheless. By the time Geoffrey finally retired for the evening, the entire village buzzed with conversation. Stories circulated from one group to another. Details grew slightly more dramatic with each retelling. Human nature worked much the same then as now. Thomas returned home thoughtful. He had spent months viewing medieval dentistry through the lens of personal experience. Pain, infection, extraction, recovery. Geoffrey's stories revealed a wider picture, a world filled with practitioners, theories, experiments, successes, failures, and endless attempts to combat one of humanity's oldest sources of suffering. Yet among all the tales shared that evening, one particular story lingered in Geoffrey's mind, a story he had deliberately saved for another day, a story involving a nobleman, a royal physician, and one of the most shocking dental procedures Thomas would ever hear about. And when Geoffrey finally told that story, the villagers of Bricewell would discover that even wealth and privilege could not protect someone from the brutal realities of medieval dentistry. Several days passed before Geoffrey shared the story. The delay only increased curiosity. Whenever villagers encountered him near the alehouse, at the market, or beside the well, someone eventually asked about it. The traveler always smiled, then changed the subject. By the time he finally agreed to tell it, anticipation had spread throughout Bricewell. The evening chosen for the story was cool, but pleasant. Spring rains had recently passed through the countryside. The air smelled fresh. The alehouse filled quickly, not because people expected great entertainment, because life in a small medieval village rarely offered opportunities to hear first-hand accounts from someone who had traveled widely. Thomas arrived early. Walter sat nearby. Father Matthew occupied his usual place near the hearth. Before long, Geoffrey stood and raised his cup. The room quieted. Then the traveler began. Years earlier, while staying in a prosperous town far to the south, he had met an elderly physician. The man possessed a remarkable memory and enjoyed telling stories from earlier decades. One particular tale concerned a nobleman, not a king, not a prince, but wealthy enough to command servants, horses, land, and medical attention unavailable to ordinary people. According to the physician, the nobleman developed a severe toothache. At first, he ignored it. This detail immediately amused the audience. Even rich people apparently delayed seeking treatment. The pain worsened. The nobleman became irritable. Sleep suffered. Meals became unpleasant. Eventually, he summoned a physician. The physician examined him carefully, offered remedies, herbal mixtures, rinses, various treatments intended to ease discomfort. Nothing worked. Weeks passed. The nobleman's condition deteriorated. The pain became constant. Visitors reportedly noticed changes in his personality. He grew short-tempered, distracted, unpleasant to be around. Several listeners laughed knowingly. Chronic pain often produced such effects. Then Geoffrey reached the most interesting part. The nobleman demanded stronger treatment. He wanted the tooth removed. Simple enough in theory, except for one problem. The physician lacked confidence in performing extractions. Many medieval physicians focused primarily upon diagnosis and theory rather than surgery. Physical procedures often fell to surgeons or barber-surgeons. The physician therefore recommended bringing in someone with practical experience. The nobleman refused, pride apparently played a role. Perhaps impatience, perhaps both. Whatever the reason, he insisted treatment occur immediately. The physician reluctantly agreed. Thomas leaned forward. Something about the story already felt dangerous. Geoffrey continued. The physician selected instruments, prepared the patient, gathered assistance, then attempted the extraction. The first attempt failed. The second attempt failed. The third attempt produced a terrible cracking sound. Several villagers winced. Even before hearing the outcome, they sensed trouble. The physician had broken the tooth. Part remained inside the jaw. Exactly the complication Thomas had witnessed in Northbridge. The room grew quiet. Everyone understood how unpleasant matters could become from there. Yet Geoffrey was not finished. The physician attempted to remove the remaining fragments. More difficulties followed. The procedure stretched far longer than expected. The nobleman reportedly screamed loud enough for servants throughout the estate to hear. At one point, according to the story, several attendants considered restraining him physically. When the ordeal finally ended, everyone involved felt exhausted. The tooth eventually came out, but only after extraordinary effort. The audience reacted with a mixture of horror and sympathy. Geoffrey nodded, then added one final detail. The physician later admitted he would rather have treated 10 broken bones than repeat that extraction. Laughter spread through the room. Dark laughter, the kind born from recognizing uncomfortable truths. The story carried an obvious lesson. Wealth improved many aspects of life. It did not magically simplify dentistry. A difficult tooth remained difficult regardless of social status. After the laughter faded, Geoffrey shared additional examples. Some came from towns, others from monasteries, still others from travelers he had met on the road. One involved a merchant who lost several teeth after a riding accident. Another concerned a sailor whose diet ruined much of his mouth over time. A third described an elderly woman who survived into remarkable old age despite possessing almost no teeth at all. These stories fascinated Thomas, not because they were extraordinary, because they were ordinary. Dental problems appeared everywhere, among every social class, across every region. The details changed. The pattern remained surprisingly familiar. As the evening continued, Father Matthew asked a thoughtful question. Do people fear dentists more than surgeons? The room laughed immediately. Yet Geoffrey considered the question seriously. Sometimes he took a sip of ale, then elaborated. Many surgical procedures occurred only after major injuries. Accidents, wounds, emergencies. People did not choose them. Dental treatment often involved a different kind of fear. Patients walked toward it knowingly. They sat in the chair voluntarily. They watched instruments approach. They anticipated pain before it arrived. Several listeners nodded. The distinction made sense. expectation could be terrifying. Thomas certainly remembered the feeling. The wooden chair in Weatherford, the iron forceps, the certainty that pain was seconds away. The memory remained vivid even months later. Geoffrey eventually described another curious aspect of medieval dentistry: entertainment, or rather, the strange overlap between medicine and performance. Some traveling tooth drawers developed reputations, almost like entertainers. They dressed dramatically, spoke loudly, performed extractions before crowds, advertised constantly. Thomas found the idea increasingly believable. The tooth drawer he had visited certainly possessed theatrical qualities. Confidence helped attract customers. Customers provided income. The logic seemed straightforward. The traveler recalled seeing one practitioner accompanied by musicians. Another traveled with assistants who praised his skills publicly. A third supposedly claimed divine guidance. The audience laughed again, yet Geoffrey insisted such behavior existed. In a world without printed advertisements available to most people, reputation traveled through stories. Practitioners learned to attract attention however they could. The discussion gradually shifted toward broader questions. Why were dental problems so common? Why did some people suffer more than others? What could be done to prevent them? Here Geoffrey proved surprisingly practical. He emphasized cleanliness, moderation, attention to early symptoms, not because these guaranteed protection, because ignoring problems often made them worse. Thomas thought of Walter immediately. Everyone else probably did as well. The lesson remained fresh. As the gathering slowly broke apart later that night, Geoffrey lingered near the hearth. Thomas joined him. The two men spoke quietly. The traveler seemed pleased by the villagers' interest. People think history belongs only to kings, Geoffrey said. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Geoffrey smiled. Most lives are not lived in palaces. The statement hung in the air. Then he continued. Wars mattered. Politics mattered. Great events mattered. Yet ordinary experiences connected far more people. Illness, work, family, hunger, fear, pain. Those experiences crossed every boundary. Thomas understood immediately. A rotten tooth in Bricewell, a toothache in a monastery, a nobleman suffering in a distant manor. Different lives, the same pain, the same fear, the same hope for relief. The observation stayed with him long after the conversation ended. Over the following weeks, spring deepened. Fields turned green. Planting season accelerated. Work consumed much of each day. Geoffrey remained in the village longer than expected. The traveler seemed content to rest before continuing his journeys. His stories became a regular feature of evening gatherings. Some involved medicine, others involved trade, religion, weather, or distant lands. Yet dental stories always attracted particular attention. Perhaps because everyone possessed teeth. Perhaps because everyone feared losing them. One evening, after a long day in the fields, Thomas arrived at the alehouse to find Geoffrey unusually thoughtful. The traveler stared into the fire. His expression seemed distant. When asked what troubled him, he hesitated. Then he mentioned another memory. Not amusing, not educational, not entertaining. A darker memory. A memory involving a city, a public execution, and a dental practice so disturbing that it revealed just how desperate some people became when suffering from chronic pain. The room grew quiet immediately. Even Geoffrey seemed reluctant to continue. Yet eventually he agreed, and the story he began that night would reveal one of the strangest and most unsettling chapters in the long history of medieval dentistry. The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the usual sounds of the alehouse seemed to fade. The crackling fire, the clinking cups, the low conversations near the back wall. Everything softened as Geoffrey stared into the flames. For the first time since arriving in Bricewell, the traveler appeared genuinely uncomfortable. Not frightened, not nervous, simply reluctant. Thomas noticed immediately. So did everyone else. Walter leaned forward. Father Matthew folded his hands. Several villagers exchanged curious glances. Whatever story Geoffrey intended to tell, it clearly differed from the others. Finally, the traveler spoke. This happened many years ago. His voice sounded lower than usual. I was staying in a city near the coast. The city itself mattered little. What mattered was the event. Geoffrey explained that during his travels, he occasionally visited public executions, not out of cruelty, not out of fascination with death, because such events attracted enormous crowds. Where crowds gathered, merchants gathered. Where merchants gathered, news spread. Travelers often learned more in a single crowded marketplace than during weeks on the road. The execution in question involved a convicted criminal, someone accused of serious crimes. The details had faded from memory. What Geoffrey remembered clearly was everything surrounding the event. Thousands of people filled the streets. Vendors sold food. Musicians performed. Traders conducted business. Children ran between groups of spectators. Modern people often imagine public executions as solemn affairs. Many were not. They frequently resembled public gatherings, social events. Crowds arrived from miles away. People discussed politics, shared rumors, conducted trade. Human nature remained complicated. Geoffrey stood among the spectators, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Then he noticed something unusual. Near the edge of the square stood several individuals, watching the preparations with intense interest. Nothing strange about that, except these particular observers appeared unhealthy, not sick in the obvious sense. They repeatedly touched their jaws, rubbed their cheeks, pressed fingers against their mouths. One man even carried a cloth against the side of his face. Geoffrey eventually asked a nearby merchant about them. The answer surprised him. "They're waiting." Waiting for what? The merchant pointed toward the execution platform, then explained. In some places, people believed contact with the body of an executed criminal could cure toothaches. The room fell silent. Thomas blinked. Surely he had misunderstood. Yet Geoffrey continued. The belief existed in various forms across different regions. Some sufferers attended executions, specifically hopping for relief. The logic varied depending upon who explained it. Some described mystical transfer. Others mentioned supernatural influence. A few connected the practice to ancient traditions. No one fully understood. Regardless of explanation, the result remained the same. People with terrible toothaches gathered around executions, seeking cures. Several villagers stared in disbelief. Father Matthew rubbed his beard thoughtfully. Walter looked horrified. Geoffrey could hardly blame them. His own reaction had been similar. Yet the strangest part remained ahead. After the execution concluded, some individuals approached the body. Specifically, they sought physical contact. Certain sufferers believed touching the deceased person's hand against the painful area might remove the toothache. The practice sounded bizarre, disturbing, unpleasant, yet Geoffrey insisted it happened. Not once, not twice, multiple times during his travels. Thomas struggled to process the idea. Then he remembered something important. Pain altered behavior. Extreme pain altered it even more. History repeatedly demonstrated that desperate people often embraced desperate solutions. If someone suffered for months or years without relief, unusual remedies might begin sounding reasonable. Geoffrey emphasized that such practices did not represent mainstream medicine. Physicians generally did not recommend them. Surgeons did not perform them. Yet popular beliefs sometimes followed different paths than professional knowledge. The discussion that followed became surprisingly thoughtful. Why did such ideas emerge? Why did people believe them? Father Matthew offered one explanation. Human beings naturally searched for patterns. When someone tried a remedy and the pain later disappeared, they often connected the two events. Whether the remedy actually caused improvement became a separate question. Geoffrey nodded. Throughout history, many dental problems eventually improved on their own. Some teeth died. Some infections drained naturally. Some periods of pain faded temporarily. If improvement happened after a ritual, people remembered the ritual. They rarely remembered the countless times similar rituals failed. Thomas found the observation fascinating. Medieval people often receive unfair treatment in modern discussions. They are portrayed as foolish, irrational, superstitious. Yet listening to Geoffrey, Thomas realized something. People in every era searched for explanations. They worked with the information available to them. Sometimes those explanations proved wrong. Future generations would likely say the same about many modern beliefs. The evening continued. Geoffrey shared additional examples of unusual dental traditions. None matched the execution story for strangeness, yet many sounded peculiar. Some involved charms, others involved prayers. A few involved carrying specific objects believed to offer protection. Across Europe, countless local customs developed around tooth pain. Different regions created different solutions. The suffering remained universal. The remedies varied endlessly. Eventually, Father Matthew asked another question. Did any of these things actually work? Geoffrey smiled. Sometimes. The answer surprised several listeners. Then he clarified, not because the rituals possessed magical power, because people occasionally improved regardless. Human bodies recovered from certain conditions naturally. Pain fluctuated. Symptoms changed. Coincidences occurred. Distinguishing cause from coincidence remained difficult, particularly without scientific methods. The conversation shifted toward legitimate treatments. Geoffrey described practitioners who experimented constantly, surgeons refining techniques, physicians recording observations, monks preserving knowledge in manuscripts. Not every medieval medical figure relied upon superstition. Many genuinely sought understanding. Progress occurred slowly, yet it occurred. Thomas appreciated hearing that. Popular stories often focused on failures. Failures sounded dramatic. Successes sounded ordinary. Yet countless practitioners spent their lives attempting to reduce suffering, even when knowledge remained limited. The fire burned lower. Several villagers departed for home. Others remained. The atmosphere felt calmer now. Reflective, thoughtful, Geoffrey eventually admitted something personal. During his younger years, he had suffered a severe toothache himself. The revelation surprised everyone. Travelers often sounded larger than life. Hearing about their ordinary struggles humanized them. The pain lasted nearly 3 months. He could barely eat, barely sleep, barely concentrate. Eventually, a surgeon removed the tooth. The experience, according to Geoffrey, felt like being kicked in the face by a horse. Laughter filled the room. Even Geoffrey laughed. Yet nobody doubted the sincerity behind the description. Some experiences translated across generations effortlessly. Severe dental pain belonged among them. As the gathering finally ended, Thomas walked home beneath a sky filled with stars. Geoffrey's stories occupied his thoughts, not merely because they were interesting, because they revealed something deeper. Throughout history, people feared many things: war, disease, hunger, violence. Yet a surprisingly large number of ordinary people spent enormous amounts of time worrying about their teeth. The concern appeared everywhere, in villages, towns, cities, monasteries, noble households, merchant communities. The problem crossed every social boundary. Days turned into weeks. Geoffrey eventually prepared to continue his travels. Before leaving, he shared one final observation with Thomas, a thought gathered from years on the road. People think old medicine was mainly about treatments. Thomas frowned. What else would it be about? Geoffrey adjusted his pack, then smiled. Hope. The answer lingered. Practitioners offered hope. Patients sought hope. Remedies represented hope. Even strange remedies represented hope. The traveler continued. Most people already knew pain existed. Thomas nodded slowly. Geoffrey looked toward the road, stretching beyond the village. What they wanted was a reason to believe it might end. With that, he departed. Thomas watched him disappear into the distance. The traveler carried countless stories away with him, yet many remained behind. Stories of pain, recovery, mistakes, courage, fear. Stories repeated across generations. Stories repeated across history. And as Thomas returned to his ordinary life, he slowly began to understand that his own ordeal had become one of those stories, a story that would likely be told in Bricewell for years to come. A warning, a lesson, and a reminder that in the medieval world, something as small as a tooth could change the course of an entire life. Thomas did not realize how often his story would be repeated. At first, the memory remained personal, a difficult chapter, an unpleasant collection of experiences. He preferred not to revisit. Yet stories have a way of escaping the people who live them. Months passed, then years. New families arrived in Bricewell. Children grew older. Some married, others left. The village changed slowly, as villages always do. But the story remained. Whenever someone complained of a toothache, Walter Cooper's name eventually entered the conversation. So did Thomas Weaver's. Parents used the tale as a warning. Neighbors repeated it beside cooking fires. Farmers mentioned it while working in the fields. The details shifted slightly with each retelling. That was inevitable. Human memory rarely preserves events perfectly, yet the central lesson survived. Do not ignore pain forever. Do not assume problems disappear simply because you wish them to. And perhaps most importantly, do not wait until a toothache becomes something far worse. Years later, Thomas found himself laughing whenever he heard younger villagers discuss the events. Some versions made him sound unusually brave. Others made him sound foolish. A few managed to portray him as both simultaneously. The truth probably sat somewhere in between. Like most people, he had simply been frightened. Frightened of pain, frightened of treatment, frightened of uncertainty. History often celebrates courage, yet many acts of courage begin with fear. People rarely mention that part, As the years continued passing, Thomas occasionally reflected upon the strange chain of events started by a single damaged tooth. Had the pain never appeared, he might never have visited Weatherford, never met the tooth drawer, never traveled to Northbridge, never encountered Master Edmund, never listened to Geoffrey's stories. A tiny cavity had quietly altered the course of his life. The realization fascinated him. Human beings often imagine life changing through dramatic events. Battles, royal decrees, natural disasters, great discoveries. Yet many lives turn because of far smaller moments. A missed step, a chance conversation, a winter illness, a rotten tooth. By the time Thomas reached old age, several of his own teeth had disappeared. Some fell out naturally. Others required removal. The process remained unpleasant every time. Medieval dentistry improved slowly, very slowly. No miracle transformation arrived during his lifetime. No sudden revolution erased suffering. People still feared extractions, still dreaded infections, still searched for relief. Yet knowledge continued accumulating. Each generation learned something from the one before. Practitioners recorded observations. Techniques improved. Mistakes taught lessons. The progress appeared almost invisible when viewed year by year. Yet over centuries, those small improvements would eventually transform dental care completely. Thomas never lived long enough to see that future. He never witnessed anesthesia, never saw antibiotics, never encountered modern dental instruments. He never sat beneath bright electric lights. While a trained professional explained procedures using scientific knowledge accumulated across generations, such things belonged to a world beyond imagination. His world remained one of uncertainty, a world where courage often meant sitting in a wooden chair while someone approached with iron forceps, a world where survival sometimes depended upon reaching help before infections spread, a world where a skilled practitioner represented one of the most valuable people a community could possess. One autumn evening, many years after his ordeal, Thomas sat outside his cottage watching the sunset. The fields glowed gold beneath fading light. Children laughed somewhere in the distance. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. Life felt peaceful. His youngest daughter had grown into adulthood. His son now worked fields of his own. Time had carried everything forward. As old age often encourages reflection, Thomas found himself thinking once more about Master Edmund. The surgeon had saved his life, perhaps Walter's as well. Yet the man himself would likely never appear in history books. No king would reward him publicly. No grand monument would honor his work. His name would survive mainly through memories, through stories, through the people he helped. Thomas suspected history contained countless individuals like him, quiet professionals doing difficult work with limited tools, and imperfect knowledge, not heroes in the dramatic sense, yet important nonetheless. The thought felt appropriate because the story of medieval dentistry was never really about instruments, not about forceps, not about knives, not even about teeth. At its heart, it was a story about people, people trying to ease suffering, people searching for answers, people confronting pain with whatever knowledge they possessed, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, always trying. Modern readers often laugh at medieval medicine. Sometimes the criticism is deserved. Many beliefs proved incorrect. Many treatments proved ineffective. Some were undeniably terrifying. Yet behind those flaws stood generations of human beings, attempting to solve problems they barely understood. Their tools were crude, their theories incomplete, their circumstances difficult. Still, they persisted. And because they persisted, future generations inherited greater knowledge. The chain never truly stopped. Each era learned from the last. Each generation carried understanding forward. The comfortable dental offices of the modern world exist partly because countless forgotten practitioners spent centuries wrestling with the same problems, problems that once tormented people like Thomas Weaver. As darkness settled across Bricewell, the old farmer rose slowly from his seat. His joints ached, his back complained. Age carried its own collection of discomforts. Yet one particular pain no longer haunted him, the terrible throbbing that had once dominated his life remained only a memory, a distant memory, the sort that becomes easier to discuss with every passing year. He glanced toward the fading horizon, then toward the village that had been his home since birth, the same village where a toothache had nearly killed him, the same village where neighbors had helped his family, where stories continued to travel from one generation to the next. A small place, an ordinary place, yet filled with the ordinary lives that make up most of human history. And somewhere, perhaps years later, another villager would sit beside another fire, telling the story once again. The story of Thomas Weaver, the rotten tooth, the winter journey, the terrifying extraction, the infection, the recovery, and the lesson everyone remembered. Sometimes the smallest problems become the largest dangers, and sometimes surviving them becomes a story worth telling. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.